The morning Emily Carter brought her newborn son to sign the papers that would end her marriage, the rain over Manhattan looked less like weather and more like a warning. She stepped out of a yellow cab in front of Whitmore Global with one hand gripping the worn strap of her diaper bag and the other holding Noah against her chest, wrapped in a pale blue blanket that still smelled faintly of hospital soap. He was only 12 days old, too small to know that the glass tower rising above them belonged to the father who had never held him, too innocent to understand why his mother had spent the night awake, staring at a divorce summons on the kitchen table of her small Queens apartment. Emily was still weak from delivery. Her coat did not hide how thin she had become, and every step across the slick sidewalk pulled at a body that had not yet healed. But she did not turn back. The security guards at the front entrance recognized her, though neither of them said Mrs. Whitmore the way they used to. One looked at the baby, then at the camera crews gathered near the revolving doors, and his expression softened with something like pity. That was when Emily saw the reporters. At least a dozen of them stood behind the velvet barriers, holding microphones and phones, whispering her name like it was a rumor they had been waiting to confirm. Someone had tipped them off. Of course someone had. Alexander Whitmore never allowed accidents near his reputation. For 3 years, he had been the golden billionaire of New York, the self-made face of discipline, wealth, and control. For 2 of those years, Emily had been his quiet wife, the woman no one understood, the girl from a diner in Albany who somehow ended up wearing a Whitmore diamond ring. And for the last 6 months, she had been invisible. No public appearances, no answered calls, no husband in the hospital room when their son arrived just after midnight during a spring storm. A flash went off as she reached the entrance, bright enough to make Noah stir. Emily lowered her face, shielding him with her body, but she did not run. Running was what they expected from a poor woman surrounded by polished marble and expensive suits. Running was what Vanessa Reed would have wanted. Instead, Emily lifted her chin and walked inside. The lobby smelled of orchids, coffee, and money. Everything shone, from the 20-foot windows to the black stone floor that reflected her scuffed flats with cruel clarity. She could feel the receptionist staring. She could feel the employees pretending not to look as whispers moved through the room faster than the rain sliding down the windows. On the massive screen behind the front desk, Alexander's face appeared beside a headline about Whitmore Global's upcoming merger, his gray eyes calm, his jaw sharp, his smile perfectly measured for investors. Emily almost laughed. The world knew that version of him. It did not know the man who had stopped coming home after one ugly argument. The man who let his lawyers speak for him while she learned how to fold tiny onesies alone. The elevator doors opened, and Henry from security cleared his throat gently. 38th floor, ma'am. Ma'am, not Mrs. Whitmore. Emily nodded once and stepped inside. As the doors closed, Noah made a soft sound and curled his tiny fingers around the edge of her blouse. She looked down at him, and the ache in her chest became steadier, harder, almost brave. In the diaper bag beneath his blanket was a sealed envelope she had not opened, delivered that morning by a courier who said it came from the late Richard Whitmore's private attorney. Emily did not know what was inside. She only knew the words written across the front in careful black ink. For the day they try to erase you and the child. By the time the elevator reached the 38th floor, her hands had stopped shaking. She had come to sign a divorce, but something in that tower was waiting to be exposed. The elevator opened into a hallway so quiet that Emily could hear the rain tapping against the tall windows at the far end. The 38th floor of Whitmore Global had always felt less like an office and more like a private club built above the rest of the city, all dark wood panels, framed awards, and rugs so thick her shoes barely made a sound. A young assistant stood beside the reception desk with a tablet pressed against her chest, her eyes widening when she saw the baby. "Emily," she said after a nervous pause, choosing Emily's maiden name like it had been typed into her instructions. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting in conference room B." Emily gave no correction. She had learned, over the past 6 months, that people revealed more by the names they chose than by the words they spoke. She followed the assistant past closed doors and glass walls, past executives who suddenly found reasons to study their phones. Noah slept against her, warm and weightless, his little cheek resting near her collarbone. She wanted to whisper that it would be over soon, but she was no longer sure what over meant. At the last door, the assistant stepped aside and opened it. The room beyond was long and bright, with a polished table that could have seated 20 people, though only 4 chairs were occupied. Alexander Whitmore sat at the head of the table, exactly where everyone expected him to be. His black suit looked custom-made, his silver watch caught the light, and his expression held the same calm distance he used in interviews when reporters asked about risk, profit, and sacrifice. For 1 second, Emily's memory betrayed her. She saw him in their old kitchen, barefoot, laughing because she had burned pancakes on a Sunday morning. Then Vanessa Reed shifted in the chair beside him, and the memory disappeared. Vanessa wore cream-colored silk and a diamond bracelet Emily recognized immediately. It had belonged to Alexander's mother, Eleanor, a family piece Emily had once seen locked in a velvet case during a charity gala. Vanessa rested her manicured hand near Alexander's wrist, close enough to make a statement without saying a word. Across from them sat Alexander's attorney, Martin Hale, with a stack of papers arranged so neatly they looked less like documents and more like a trap. Beside him was another lawyer Emily did not know, a woman with a blank face and a gold pen already uncapped. No one stood when Emily entered. No one offered her a chair until the assistant pulled one out at the far end of the table, the place farthest from Alexander, as if distance could erase a marriage. Emily sat carefully, keeping Noah against her chest. Her stitches ached, and she was suddenly aware of how pale her hands looked against the blue blanket. Alexander's eyes moved to the baby for half a second, then away. That small avoidance hurt more than any insult Vanessa could have prepared. Martin Hale cleared his throat. This meeting is to finalize the dissolution agreement between Alexander Whitmore and Emily Carter. The terms have been delivered in advance. Emily looked at the papers in front of her. She had read them at 2 in the morning while Noah cried and the apartment heater clicked like an old clock. She would leave with nothing from the marriage. She would give up any claim connected to Whitmore assets. She would agree not to speak publicly about Alexander, Vanessa, or the circumstances surrounding the separation. Worst of all, the document referred to Noah only as the child, never as Alexander's son. Vanessa smiled softly, as though she had been waiting for Emily to notice. "It is better this way," she said, her voice smooth and sweet enough for strangers to believe. Clean endings are kinder, especially when everyone knows the truth is complicated. Emily lifted her eyes to Alexander, hoping for one flicker of shame, one sign that the man she had loved was still somewhere behind that expensive suit. But he only leaned back and folded his hands. "Sign the agreement, Emily," he said. "Let us stop pretending this family ever existed." For a moment, the only sound in the conference room was Noah's soft breathing against Emily's coat. Alexander's words hung over the table like cold air from an open window, and every person there seemed to wait for her to break. Maybe they expected tears. Maybe they expected her to beg him to remember the woman he had once promised to protect in a courthouse garden with traffic humming on Fifth Avenue behind them. But Emily had spent too many nights learning how to cry quietly while feeding a newborn at 3 in the morning. She had no tears left to give an audience. She looked at Alexander, really looked at him, and wondered how a man could sit 10 feet away from his own son and act as if the child were a rumor. "Pretending," she repeated softly. Vanessa's smile sharpened. Martin Hale shifted one page forward with 2 fingers. "Emily, the agreement includes a generous confidentiality provision. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to cover 3 months of housing assistance as a private courtesy." Emily almost smiled at that. 3 months. Alexander owned apartments he had never slept in, cars he forgot he had purchased, watches worth more than her mother's old house outside Albany, and his idea of mercy was 3 months of rent for the woman who had carried his child alone. "A private courtesy," Emily said. "How thoughtful." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Vanessa leaned back, crossing one ankle behind the other with careful elegance. "No one is trying to be cruel, Emily, but you have to understand how this looks. You disappeared from Alexander's life, refused proper communication, and then arrived with a baby at a very convenient time." Emily felt Noah stir. She placed one hand gently over the blanket, steadying both him and herself. "I disappeared?" she asked. "I called this office 37 times after your husband's attorney sent the separation letter. I sent medical updates, ultrasound photos, hospital admission forms. I sent one message when my doctor said I might deliver early." Alexander's eyes flickered, But Vanessa spoke before he could. Anyone can claim to send messages. Emily turned to her. And anyone can make sure they are never received. The room changed so subtly that only someone desperate would have missed it. Vanessa's fingers paused on the edge of her bracelet. Martin Hale lowered his gaze to the contract. Alexander noticed. Emily saw that he noticed, and for the first time that morning, a tiny crack appeared in the wall he had built around himself. "Are you accusing someone?" Alexander asked, his voice controlled. "No," Emily said. "I am remembering." She reached into the diaper bag, and Vanessa straightened, as if expecting a weapon made of truth. Emily removed a folded hospital discharge paper and placed it on the table. Then she placed Noah's birth certificate beside it. The paper looked painfully ordinary beneath the white conference lights. A name, a date, a county seal, a mother, a father. Alexander's name sat there in black ink, clear and unshaken. He looked at it longer than he meant to. Vanessa let out a small laugh, too quick and too bright. A birth certificate is not proof of anything. People write whatever they want on forms. Emily did not look at her. Her eyes stayed on Alexander. "You were not there when he was born. You were not there when they asked for his father's name. I still gave them yours because I was foolish enough to think the truth mattered." Alexander's face hardened again, but now it looked less like certainty and more like defense. "There will be a DNA test before any acknowledgement is made." The sentence was quiet, but it landed with more cruelty than if he had shouted. Emily inhaled slowly. Her body wanted to tremble, but her pride would not allow it. "Of course," she said, "because the woman who slept beside you through every sleepless merger, every panic attack you denied having, every anniversary of your father's death, is suddenly a liar because Vanessa told you a better story." Vanessa's cheeks flushed, though her smile remained. "Careful, Emily." Emily finally turned to her. "No, I was careful for 6 months. I was careful with his reputation, careful with his family name, careful not to let the nurses know my husband was choosing silence while I signed newborn forms alone. I am done being careful." Noah made a small sound then, a fragile little cry that filled the enormous room with something no contract could control. Emily stood, though the movement made pain flash through her abdomen. She held her son closer and looked down at the papers waiting for her signature. "If you want this marriage ended, Alexander, I will end it. But do not ask me to erase my child to make your betrayal look clean." Alexander looked at the birth certificate as if the ink itself had accused him. For several seconds, the man who could silence boardrooms with one glance said nothing, and Emily saw the uncertainty he tried to hide. It was small, barely a shadow across his eyes, but Vanessa saw it too. Her hand moved to his sleeve, graceful and possessive, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light like a warning. "Alex," she said gently, "this is exactly what we discussed. Emotional pressure, public sympathy, a baby in the room to make you hesitate." Emily let out a quiet breath. The cruelty of that sentence should have surprised her, but it did not. Vanessa had built her power from soft words wrapped around sharp intentions. Martin Hale cleared his throat again, eager to return the room to paper and signatures. "Emily, we understand this is an emotional situation. However, the agreement is straightforward. You will sign the dissolution documents today. Any matter regarding paternity will be handled privately at a later date." "Privately," Emily repeated. That seems to be everyone's favorite word when the truth is inconvenient. The second attorney beside Martin opened a folder and slid another page forward. "There is also a non-disparagement clause. You will refrain from making statements that could damage Mr. Whitmore's public image, Whitmore Global, or any associated parties." Vanessa's smile returned in full. "That part is important. A company this large cannot afford messy stories. Investors do not respond well to scandal, especially when the claims come from someone with nothing to lose." Emily's fingers tightened around Noah's blanket. "I have everything to lose," she said. "I am holding him." For the first time, Alexander looked directly at the child. Noah's eyes were still closed, his tiny mouth relaxed after crying, one fist resting against Emily's collar. Something moved across Alexander's face, but Vanessa leaned closer before it could become human. "Alex, please, do not let her use this moment." Then she turned to Emily with a tone so sweet, it almost sounded kind. "You should think carefully about what is best for the baby. A quiet life would be easier for him. A small apartment, a fresh start, no reporters, no lawsuits, No questions about who his father really is. Emily stared at her. You mean no Whitmore name? I mean no confusion, Vanessa said. Children suffer when mothers insist on dragging them into worlds where they do not belong. The words landed with practiced elegance, but they revealed too much. Emily saw. Martin's pen stopped moving. She saw Alexander's eyes narrow slightly. Vanessa was no longer just defending him. She was trying to erase Noah before a test, before a court, before anyone with power could look at him and ask the obvious question. Emily sat down slowly, not because she was defeated, but because standing had begun to hurt. She adjusted Noah in her arms and reached for the black pen lying beside the contract. Alexander washed her hand. Emily, he said, and her name sounded different now, lower, less certain. She did not look up. What? You do not have to make this dramatic. That almost broke something in her. Not because it was cruel, but because he still believed the pain in the room had been created by her voice instead of his choices. Dramatic was leaving your pregnant wife to hear from your attorney, she said. Dramatic was letting another woman wear your mother's bracelet in front of me. This is not drama, Alexander. This is paperwork. Vanessa's face tightened, but Emily had already lowered the pen to the page. At that exact moment, a knock sounded at the conference room door. It was not timid. It was steady, formal, and impossible to ignore. Martin frowned. This room is occupied. The door opened anyway. A tall older man in a navy overcoat stepped inside, rain still shining on his shoulders. His silver hair was neatly combed, and in his hand was a sealed envelope with the Whitmore family crest pressed into dark wax. Alexander rose halfway from his chair, recognition cutting through his composure. Henry Lawson? The older man did not smile. His gaze moved from Alexander to Vanessa, then to Emily and the newborn in her arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm weight of someone who had waited years for this moment. I apologize for the interruption, he said, but I was instructed by the late Richard Whitmore to deliver this before any divorce papers were signed. The name Richard Whitmore changed the air in the room more completely than any storm outside could have done. Alexander stood frozen beside his chair, his hand still resting on the edge of the polished table. His father had been dead for almost 4 years, yet the sound of his name still carried authority through Whitmore Global, as if the building itself remembered who had built it. Vanessa was the first to recover. This is highly inappropriate, she said, her voice bright with forced composure. Mr. Lawson, this is a private legal matter. Henry Lawson looked at her with the polite disinterest of a man who had spent 40 years watching ambitious people mistake volume for power. Miss Reed, I am aware of the nature of this meeting. That is why I am here. Martin Hale pushed back his chair, his expression tight. Mr. Lawson, unless you represent one of the parties in this proceeding, I must ask you to leave. Henry placed the sealed envelope on the table, directly between Alexander and Emily. I represent the final instructions of Richard Whitmore. Those instructions concern this proceeding. Emily stared at the envelope. The crest pressed into the wax was the same one she had seen carved above the fireplace at the Whitmore estate in Connecticut, back when Eleanor Whitmore still invited her for Sunday dinners and Alexander still held her hand under the table. She had not known Richard well. He had already been ill when she met him, a tall, watchful man with tired eyes and a voice that softened only when he spoke to Eleanor. But once, after dinner, he had found Emily on the terrace and told her that families like his were very good at protecting money and very bad at protecting hearts. She had thought he was only being kind. Now Henry Lawson opened his leather briefcase and removed a small tablet, a notarized document, and a second envelope, thinner than the first. Before his death, Mr. Whitmore recorded a statement and amended a private provision of the family trust. He gave clear instructions that the statement was to be presented only under specific circumstances. Alexander's face had gone pale beneath his controlled expression. What circumstances? Henry glanced at the divorce papers spread before Emily, then at the baby in her arms. If your wife was brought into a legal proceeding within 1 year of giving birth, and if there was any attempt to sever her child from the Whitmore family without verified cause. Vanessa let out a soft, incredulous laugh. That is absurd. Richard Whitmore never met this child. Henry answered calmly. Richard wrote that clause years before Noah was born. It protected any lawful wife of Alexander who gave birth during a contested separation. No, Henry said calmly. But he knew his son. The sentence struck harder than accusation. Alexander looked away, and for the first time that morning, shame seemed to reach him before anger could. Henry tapped the tablet, and Richard Whitmore's face appeared on the screen. The room fell into a silence so deep that even Noah seemed to quiet in Emily's arms. Richard looked thinner than Emily remembered, seated in what appeared to be his study, a fire burning behind him. His voice, when it came through the speaker, was weak but steady. Alexander, if you are watching this, then you have allowed pride, fear, or someone else's ambition to bring you to the edge of a mistake I hoped you would never make. Alexander's fingers curled against the table. Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out. The video continued. Richard spoke of the Whitmore name, not as a crown, but as a burden. He said wealth made men believe they were excellent judges of truth, when often they were only excellent targets for lies. Then his gaze shifted slightly, as if he were looking beyond the camera toward someone he loved. If Emily has given birth to your child, that child is not to be negotiated away in a conference room. Until paternity is verified by an independent court-approved laboratory, Emily Carter and the child are to remain protected under the Whitmore Family Trust. Martin Hale went still. The second attorney stopped writing. Henry then opened the notarized document and read the provision aloud. If Alexander initiated divorce proceedings against Emily within 12 months of childbirth, while publicly or privately maintaining a relationship with another woman, his temporary voting control over a significant portion of Whitmore family shares would be suspended pending review by the trust board. Vanessa's elegant mask finally cracked. That cannot be enforceable, she said, turning to Alexander. He was sick. He was not thinking. Clearly, Henry's eyes sharpened. Every signature was witnessed, reviewed, and certified in New York County. Richard Whitmore knew exactly what he was doing. Emily looked down at Noah, unable to breathe for a moment. She had walked into that room expecting to be erased. Instead, a man buried 4 years ago had left behind a door no one could quietly close. Alexander sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the frozen image of his father. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan, but inside the room, the loudest thing was Vanessa's silence. The tablet screen went dark, but Richard Whitmore's words remained in the room as if they had been written across the glass walls. Alexander did not move. His face had lost the polished certainty that usually made people obey before he finished speaking. For the first time since Emily had entered, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a son who had just been seen clearly by a father he could no longer argue with. Henry Lawson closed the folder with quiet precision. The trust board has already been notified that this meeting is taking place, he said. If the divorce proceeds under these terms, the review begins this afternoon. Martin Hale's complexion changed. Mr. Whitmore, he said carefully, we should pause before taking any further action. Vanessa turned on him with a sharp whisper. Do not be ridiculous. A trust review is only procedural. It does not prove anything. No, Henry said. It does not prove paternity. It proves Richard Whitmore anticipated the possibility of undue influence. The phrase landed directly on Vanessa. Emily saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her fingers closed around the bracelet that had never belonged to her. Alexander noticed too. His gaze moved from Henry to Vanessa, then to the papers that would have stripped Noah of any place in the family before a single test had been done. Who drafted this agreement? Alexander asked. Martin hesitated. My office prepared it based on instructions. Whose instructions? The question was quiet, but now there was steel beneath it. Vanessa reached for his arm. Alex, you approved the strategy. Everyone agreed it was necessary to protect you. Emily almost looked away. That was what Vanessa did best. She wrapped control in the language of protection until suspicion sounded like wisdom and cruelty sounded like caution. Noah stirred again, his tiny face turning toward the warmth of Emily's chest. His blanket slipped just slightly from the side of his head, and the smallest patch of skin behind his ear became visible. Henry Lawson saw it first. His expression changed so faintly Emily might have missed it if she had not been watching everyone in the room with the alertness of a mother surrounded by strangers. Then the conference room door opened again, this time without a knock. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the doorway, breathless, elegant, and pale. Her silver gray coat was damp from the rain, and her eyes went straight to the baby. I came as soon as Henry called, she said. Alexander rose at once. Mother, this is not the time. Eleanor did not look at him. She walked around the table slowly, one hand pressed to the pearls at her throat. Vanessa stood as if to greet her, but Eleanor passed her without a word. When she reached Emily, her careful composure trembled. May I see him? Emily's first instinct was to hold Noah tighter. 6 months of silence had taught her not to trust anyone with the last name Whitmore. But Eleanor's eyes were wet, not with performance, not with pity, but with a grief Emily understood. This woman had lost a husband. Now she was looking at a grandson she had not been allowed to know existed. Emily loosened the blanket just enough for Eleanor to see Noah's face. The older woman covered her mouth. Oh, she whispered. It was not a question. It was recognition. Noah yawned, his tiny head turning again, and Eleanor saw the small crescent-shaped mark behind his left ear. The color drained from her face. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. Richard had that mark, she said. Her voice broke, but she kept speaking. His father had it too. Alexander had it when he was born, faint but there. The doctors called it nothing, but Richard used to joke that the Whitmore men arrived with their signature already stamped. The silence that followed was heavier than the first. Alexander stared at his son, truly stared now, as if the baby had suddenly become real in a way no document could force. His eyes moved from the mark to Emily's exhausted face, to the way Noah's hand curled against her blouse. Something inside him seemed to loosen and fall apart. He took one step forward. Emily immediately stepped back. The movement was small, but it stopped him completely. Eleanor turned to her son then, and the warmth vanished from her face. You knew she was pregnant? Alexander did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. Eleanor looked at Vanessa's bracelet, then at the divorce papers, then back at Alexander with a pain sharper than anger. Your father feared this day, she said. I prayed he was wrong. Emily felt every eye turned toward her, but she did not feel small anymore. For the first time since entering that building, she was not the woman being judged. She was the mother holding the truth, while everyone else finally learned how heavy it was. Eleanor's question sat between Alexander and the truth he had spent months avoiding. He looked at Emily as if he expected her to explain the silence for him, to soften the shape of what he had done, but she only held Noah and waited. Vanessa broke first. This is sentimental nonsense, she said, her voice rising just enough to reveal the panic underneath. A birthmark does not establish anything. Neither does an old video from a grieving man. Alex, you cannot let them corner you like this. Henry Lawson turned to the door and gave a small nod. A moment later, a younger man stepped into the conference room carrying a slim laptop bag and an expression of visible discomfort. Emily recognized him after a second. Daniel Price. He had been Alexander's executive assistant during the first year of their marriage, the one who used to send flowers on Alexander's behalf when meetings ran late and anniversaries were nearly forgotten. He looked older now, thinner, and unable to meet Vanessa's eyes. Alexander frowned. Daniel swallowed. I am sorry, Mr. Whitmore. I should have come forward sooner. Vanessa's chair scraped softly against the floor. You have no business here. Actually, Henry said, Mr. Price contacted my office last week after learning Emily had given birth. He provided records that required immediate review. Martin Hale stood straighter. What records? Daniel placed a folder on the table and opened his laptop. Email logs, call routing reports, access records from Mr. Whitmore's private communication account, and payment documentation connected to a third-party reputation firm. Emily felt the room tilt quietly around her. Not because she was surprised, but because every lonely night suddenly had a paper trail. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Explain. Daniel took a breath. Beginning in late November, messages from Emily to your personal account were automatically redirected to a secondary archive. They never reached your main inbox. Her calls to your direct office line were screened and marked as non-urgent. Medical attachments were deleted from your visible correspondence. Alexander's face went blank in a way that was more frightening than anger. Who authorized that? Daniel looked at Vanessa. No one else needed an answer. Vanessa laughed once, brittle and false. That is absurd. I never had access to Alex's private systems. Daniel clicked the laptop, then turned the screen slightly. Your credentials were used on 5 separate dates. The building access logs place you in Mr. Whitmore's private office during those times. There are also messages between you and a consultant named Marcia Bell, discussing the need to create distance before the baby became a legal complication. The words legal complication made Eleanor close her eyes. Emily looked down at Noah, whose tiny hand had opened against her coat, as if even he refused to remain clenched inside that room. Alexander did not look at Vanessa now. He looked at the documents, then at the bracelet on her wrist, then at the divorce agreement that suddenly seemed less like legal protection and more like a carefully folded lie. What else? He asked. Daniel's voice dropped. There is a payment to a former clinic employee who altered a preliminary note in Emily's file. The original note confirmed a delivery timeline consistent with your marriage. The altered summary suggested uncertainty. That version was sent to your legal team. Martin Hale turned sharply toward Vanessa. We relied on that document. I relied on what I was told, Vanessa snapped. Everyone was protecting Alex from embarrassment. Eleanor opened her eyes. Embarrassment. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through every excuse. You tried to erase my grandson and call it protection. Vanessa looked to Alexander then, but the man beside her had disappeared into the realization of what he had allowed. Alex, she said softer now. I did this because I love you. She was going to trap you. People like her always know how to use a child. Emily lifted her head. She was tired, aching, and still wearing a coat damp from the rain. But when she spoke, her voice did not shake. People like me raise children when people like you turn them into strategy. Alexander flinched as if the sentence had found the only place money could not shield. He took another step toward Emily, slower this time. Emily, I did not know. She looked at him, and the pain in her eyes was not wild or dramatic. It was steady, which made it worse. No, she said. You chose not to know. Henry gathered the documents into a clean stack. There is enough here for civil action, internal review, and potential referral to the appropriate authorities. Vanessa's face lost its color. The conference room that had been arranged to shame Emily had become a room full of witnesses. Alexander turned to Vanessa at last, and when he spoke, there was no warmth left in him. Take off my mother's bracelet. Vanessa stared at him. Alex. Now. Her hand trembled as she unclasped it and set it on the table. Eleanor picked it up without looking at her. Emily watched the diamond circle leave Vanessa's wrist, but she felt no victory. Only a quiet, devastating relief. The truth had finally entered the room, and it did not need to shout. Vanessa stood beside the table as if the room had tilted away from her, one bare wrist exposed where the bracelet had been. No one offered it back. The diamond circle now rested in Eleanor's palm, returned to the woman it had always belonged to, and somehow that small correction made every other lie look even uglier. Alexander turned to Martin Hale with a voice that sounded unfamiliar, even to himself. Withdraw the agreement. Martin gathered the pages too quickly, as if touching them now might stain his hands. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. We can suspend this proceeding immediately and revisit the terms after independent verification. No, Alexander said. There will be no terms like these again. Then he looked at Emily, and all the power that usually surrounded him seemed to fall uselessly to the floor. Emily, he said, stepping away from Vanessa, away from the head of the table, away from the place where he had been so certain of himself. I am sorry. The words were simple. Maybe once, months ago, they would have been enough to make her heart reach for him. Maybe if he had said them outside the hospital room, or on the phone after her first missed appointment, or the night she sat alone with swollen feet and a crib still half assembled, she might have believed they could begin again. But apologies given after proof were different from trust given before pain. Emily shifted Noah higher against her shoulder. You are sorry because you were lied to, she said. I am sorry because I told the truth and still had to survive like a liar. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were red at the edges. I should have come to you. Yes, she said. You should have. I should have answered your calls. Yes. I should have been there when he was born. Her face changed then, not with anger, but with something more private and more final. You should have heard his first cry. The sentence broke him more cleanly than shouting ever could. He looked at Noah, whose tiny mouth moved in sleep, unaware that the man before him was learning the cost of absence one breath at a time. Alexander's hand lifted slightly, then stopped before he dared ask, May I hold him? Emily's arms tightened by instinct. Eleanor looked away, giving the answer room to be gentle, but Emily did not soften it. No, Alexander nodded once, accepting the wound because he knew he had earned it. Vanessa made a small sound of disbelief. This is ridiculous. Alex, you are letting her punish you in front of everyone. Emily turned to her with calm eyes. No, punishment is what you try to build for me. This is a boundary. Henry Lawson placed a fresh folder on the table, one that Emily had not noticed before. Emily retained independent counsel this morning after my courier contacted her. These documents were prepared in anticipation of today's meeting. Alexander looked from Henry to Emily. You have your own attorney? I learned quickly, she said. Henry opened the folder. Emily is prepared to sign a petition for legal separation, protection of the minor child's interests under the Whitmore Family Trust, court-supervised paternity confirmation through an independent laboratory, and temporary restrictions on unauthorized public statements regarding the child. Martin Hale exhaled slowly. The second attorney beside him read the first page and said nothing, which told Emily more than words could have. Alexander seemed stunned, not because the documents were aggressive, but because Emily had walked into his building ready not only to endure humiliation, but to answer it. You planned this? He asked. No, Emily said. I planned to leave with my dignity. The law was just something I finally realized I was allowed to use too. She sat down, carefully this time, and took the pen she had nearly used on the first agreement. Alexander moved as if to stop her, then forced himself still. Emily signed the separation petition with a steady hand. Not the cruel paper meant to erase Noah. Not the silence Vanessa had arranged. This was her signature on her own terms. When she finished, she looked at Alexander for the last time that morning as his wife in the eyes of the world, though in her heart the ending had happened long before. I do not want your private apartments, your cars, or your apology wrapped in guilt, she said. But my son will not be hidden, doubted, or used as damage control. He will have every protection your father intended for him, whether you are ready to be his father or not. Alexander's mouth trembled with words he had no right to ask her to hear. Emily placed the pen down, rose with Noah in her arms, and walked toward the door. This time, no one called her by the wrong name. No one dared reduce her to a mistake. Behind her, the old divorce papers sat unsigned, useless, and dead. The hallway outside the conference room felt different when Emily stepped into it, though nothing visible had changed. The same dark wood walls surrounded her. The same glass offices reflected her pale face. The same expensive silence followed every footstep. But the woman leaving was not the woman who had arrived. Behind her, voices began to rise, not in shouting, but in the controlled panic of powerful people realizing that control had slipped from their hands. Martin Hale was calling the trust board. Henry Lawson was collecting documents. Eleanor was telling Alexander, in a voice sharpened by grief, that he had dishonored both his wife and his father. Vanessa said his name once, then twice, but Emily did not turn around to see whether he answered. At the elevator, she pressed the button with one hand while Noah slept against her shoulder, his small warmth steady beneath the blanket. A minute later, Eleanor appeared beside her, holding the restored bracelet in one hand and an umbrella in the other. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor said, "May I walk you down?" Emily looked at her carefully. There had been too many Whitmore doors closed in her face to trust one that opened too quickly. But Eleanor did not ask for the baby. She did not make promises on Alexander's behalf. She simply stood beside Emily like a woman asking permission to remain human after her family had failed. Emily nodded. The elevator carried them down through 38 floors of money, secrets, and rain-streaked windows. In the lobby, the reporters surged forward the moment the doors opened, but Eleanor stepped slightly ahead, her posture elegant and unshakable. "No comment regarding a private family matter," she said, and somehow the room listened. Outside, the storm had softened into a cold drizzle. Eleanor opened the umbrella over Emily and Noah, shielding them from the cameras as they reached the curb. For the first time all morning, Emily allowed herself to breathe without bracing for the next insult. Back upstairs, Alexander stood alone in the conference room after Vanessa was escorted out by building security and legal counsel. No one touched her. No one needed to. The damage she had done was now sealed in folders, backed by records, and witnessed by people whose signatures could move courts and boardrooms. Alexander looked at the unsigned divorce papers, then at the empty chair where Emily had sat holding his son. The chair seemed louder than any accusation. Within 48 hours, Whitmore Global announced an internal review. Vanessa Reed disappeared from company events, then from the society pages, then from every place where she had once smiled as if victory were already hers. The court ordered an independent paternity test, though by then no one in the Whitmore family truly needed it. When the result arrived, Alexander read the words confirming what Emily had never doubted, and he sat for a long time with Noah's name on the page and his own reflection in the window looking like a stranger. Emily did not return to the penthouse. She stayed in Queens for 6 weeks, then moved into a quiet brownstone in Brooklyn arranged through the trust, not as charity, but as protection for Noah. Eleanor visited every Sunday with groceries, flowers, and stories about Richard. She never pushed Emily toward forgiveness. That was why Emily slowly learned to open the door. Alexander wrote letters, not excuses, not demands, only memories he had missed and apologies he could not repair. Emily kept them in a box, unread at first, then read on nights when Noah finally slept and the city outside felt less cruel. A year later, Whitmore Global held a special board meeting under the terms of Richard's trust. Emily arrived in a navy dress, carrying no diaper bag this time, while Eleanor walked beside her with Noah in her arms. Alexander was already seated when she entered. He stood, not as a husband expecting mercy, but as a man who had lost the right to be certain. Around the table, directors waited for the legal guardian of the trust's youngest major beneficiary to take her seat. Emily looked once at Alexander, then at the nameplate placed before her. It did not call her a mistake, a scandal, or a woman with nothing to lose. It read Emily Carter, Guardian Representative. Alexander lowered his eyes and said the words he never imagined would belong to the woman he had abandoned. "Good morning, Madam Representative." Emily sat down, calm and unafraid, while Noah laughed softly in his grandmother's arms, and for the first time in a long time, the room belonged to the truth.